And Wired magazine takes an in-depth look at a years-long string of cyber attacks in Ukraine that could have global implications. The July cover story, How to Switch a Country Off, investigates what the author calls a sustained cyber assault unlike the world has ever seen. It has undermined every sector, including the media, military, politics, and even people's homes. Andy Greenberg is the author of the story. Nicholas Thompson is Wired's editor-in-chief. He's also a CBS News contributor. Good morning to both of you. Welcome.
Morning.
It's a fascinating piece. Let's start with exactly what happened. How big was this attack on the power grid in Ukraine, and who was behind it?
Well, there are actually two. So in December 2015, for the first time in history, hackers, who we believe now were Russian hackers, took down the power for 250,000 Ukrainians in 3 regions of the country. But then they struck again a year later. And it's not only that, but their attacks are evolving. In 2015, they were attacking these distribution stations that are kind of like the capillaries of the electric system. In 2016, they took down a transmission station, which is more like an artery. So
they got more sophisticated.
There's a disturbing progression happening here.
Why are they doing it, Andy, do you think?
Well, Russia is at war with Ukraine, and they want to destabilize the country. They want to, to make it look like a failed state. But then I think the really disturbing thing is that they're also using Ukraine as a testing ground for attacks that they're honing to possibly use against Western Europe or the United States in the future.
In fact, this may be a signal of an imminent threat to the United States, right, Nick?
You know, it's a funny story, right? Because we saw these hacks going on with Russia and the Ukraine. We said, okay, we'll send Andy Greenberg to Ukraine. It'll be a terrifying story. Andy goes to the Ukraine, he reports it, and it's actually scarier than we thought because it turns out they're not only doing all these terrible things, they're not only shutting down the power grid, they're not only shutting down the railway stations, it looks like they're kind of planning to come after us. So, yeah, we thought it was bad and it was worse.
Well, Gayle and I said this morning, Gayle said to me, Norah, I'm really worried about this. This is scary stuff.
Yes. Because I do think it's only a matter of time, and I wonder how prepared we are.
Well, I think that the U.S. power grid actually, we have better cybersecurity than Ukraine, but we also have a more automated grid that in some ways is more vulnerable to cyber attack. Plus, we're not as good as Ukraine at turning the power back on. They have blackouts all the time. We, don't generally have to drive out in trucks to turn the power on. So, it's probably harder to take down our grid, but it might be easier to keep it down for a longer period of time.
And I think you're right that we have not fully prepared for this. The United States is not ready for the kind of cyber attack that the Ukraine has seen, and we should probably start getting our stuff together.
Well, exactly. But does your article and what is going on actually indicate this is tipping their hand and allowing us to get prepared? If they'd just done it as a surprise on us, we might not have been prepared. Does this help us? Because this is fairly detailed exactly how it works.
Well, that's part of the point of the article. I mean, part of the point of the article is to help make the case that these are the things you should look at. This is what we should understand. Of course, the nature of cyber war, as Andy has found, is that it's always changing and evolving, and the tools are different and the targets are different. But yes, I hope the people who protect our grid read Andy's story.
And what do you make, Andy, of the story that's breaking this morning in the Washington Post about Russian interference and hacking in the U.S. election? Seems very timely considering what you have.
One of the most interesting points in that story was that Obama had authorized similar attacks on the Russian grid if we wanted to. And I think it's important to realize that all of the most powerful nations in the world, U.S., Russia, China, probably have the ability to take down each other's power grids and infrastructure. But the scary thing is that Russia is brazen enough to actually do these things. They did it to Ukraine. They did meddle in the U.S. presidential election. There's a kind of boldness in the Putin regime that should scare everyone.
Right, you might think there'd be mutually assured destruction. They know we can take down their grid, so they won't come after us. But they went after our election, and we didn't do anything.
Exactly.
So it's not sure that this is holding so well.
You also point out in the article that as deep as they went, they could always go deeper. As bad as it seemed, it could have been much worse, which I also thought was very interesting.
Right. So in the second of these 2 power grid attacks, they only took the power down for 1 hour, but they used an incredibly sophisticated new piece of malicious software that automated the whole attack and seems designed to be used again. So that's maybe the most chilling aspect of this, is that they have a reusable, adaptable weapon that they're going to want to use again.
Nick, does the answer require the federal government, or is this a private sector initiative that needs to be undertaken?
It's going to be, a whole part of it is going to be the federal government. We need much better national tools, but it is also a private sector initiative. They have to work hand in glove, and the private sector has to very certainly look at its own stuff, hire cybersecurity experts. If you work at a power grid, you can't just rely on the federal government.
Talk about some of the characters that you interviewed in the article. I thought that was so fascinating, the Russians and the Americans.
Well, my favorite character in the story is Alexei Yasinski, who is this cybersecurity researcher in Ukraine. And I saw him on YouTube give a talk about one of those power grid attacks, and I thought he would just have good technical details.
Young guy,
so I went
too.
and visited him in Kiev. And it turned out that not only had he tracked these hackers for more than a year, but they actually shut down the power in his home. That one night he was just watching television with his family, and the power went out, and he figured out, because it was exactly midnight, because it was 1 year after the earlier power grid attack, that these hackers he'd been tracking had reached out from the internet into his home and turned off the power.
And then it became personal. He's watching Snowden.
Right. He wasn't just watching TV.
That was interesting.
Ironically.
He's watching Snowden. Really good work.
Incredible reporting. Thank you so much.
I'm just glad the lights stayed on this whole segment.
Yes.
So far, so good.
Us too. Nick Thompson and Andy Greenberg, congrats. The article appears in the July issue of Wired magazine, which hits newsstands on June 27th. That's next week.